Okay, so this is a retelling of something I did with a client back around 2008, I'm pretty sure, because it was before I knew Kanban. And I remember it because I worked with these guys, did great, and then they asked me to solve a problem that I couldn't solve for them. But if I had known Kanban, it would have been easy. So I know it was before I knew Kanban. So it's how do you use MBIs to do what I call a Pareto analysis of what needs to be done. I call this also Pareto versus Parkinson's. And this is important. So Pareto is the idea, you know, I get 80% of the value for 20% of the work. And Parkinson's law is work will fill the time allotted. Okay, so let's look at that. And we're going to learn how to work with people to see what they really need to be delivered when they aren't telling us what they really need to be delivered. How using MBIs can actually speed things up. And here was the situation. I was in the middle of training a bunch of product managers for a group of 300. This company had 300 devs as part of a division of development of about 1,000 people. So it's a big company, and the whole development organization was 3,000 people. So yeah, the whole company had 3,000. This was a branch or division of it of 1,000, and then this was a product with 300 developers. And there was I remember it was like an 11-month out delivery, and there was a good reason why that was happening. So I'd been going over general product management, and I give some theory, and then we actually work hands-on with things. So what I had them do was literally they spent a couple hours. They weren't making these up. They had these, but I want them on the wall. And I think it was about 15 feet. That's kind of how I remember this wall. And these were 4x6 stickies. And it was that dense. I mean, these are features. These aren't stories. And this is a group of 300 people for 11 months. Okay, so that's reasonable. I mean, it was like that, and there might have been more like 5 or 6 rows, but I remember that wall was full. Did not take a picture of it, wish I had. So the question was this, there was this architecture. How do we test the architecture? I remember this conversation because I had 5 different platforms, Linux, Windows, HPUX, AIX, and Solaris. That kind of dates it right there. Solaris still existed, okay? And they asked me because they knew I'd written, you know, design patterns books. We had been doing technical training for them as well, behavioral driven development and things of that nature. So we had a lot of credibility. So they're saying, Al, you know this stuff, tell us. And the question was, are we going to build it like let's build Linux and then let's build Windows support and then let's build HPUX? That's not a bad way to go. But the other question was, well, maybe we'll take a feature and build it across all 5 to make sure we have it. Okay. Now my guess, and I actually didn't answer this to them, I gave them a couple ideas. What I would do is I'd probably take a feature and you know, build it across all 5. Then I take a different feature, or maybe not all 5, maybe 3. There's also this thing I call the analysis matrix that I have recordings on that talks about how to look at the commonalities and variabilities of stuff like this. But basically, I said, look, I really can't help you exactly because I didn't have the time to give him in depth. But I gave him the issues to look at. You want to eliminate, you want to lower the risks. You want to bring up the issues of architecture. So there was a few things. But what I really wanted to do was give him a smaller problem. In other words, why work on 11 months of work? Was there a subset? So what I asked them was, because the answer wasn't clear, I asked them how many of these features were absolutely needed, because they were sure they were. In fact, they said all of them. Now, I didn't believe this for a second, but you don't tell a client, I don't believe you, not for a second. That doesn't go over too well. So what I have learned, this is a coaching tip. What I have learned, when somebody tells you something that you severely doubt, you don't come from it's not true. You come from it is true. And you ask them questions that would get answered one way if it was true, and questions that the same question that would get answered differently if it wasn't true. And you let them give you the answers. So you're coming from, oh, I totally believe you. You don't say that, but you're coming from, I totally believe you, while inside say, I don't believe these guys for a second. But I've got to give them a question that the way they answer will determine to them what's true or not. Okay, I've just learned this, the coaching technique. So I didn't believe this. But again, I've learned not to challenge it. So I asked them this, how many of you are absolutely certain you get all this done by the end of the project? This was 11 months out. Like I said, there was a good reason for it. I don't need to go into. No one raised their hand, which I was totally expecting. So then I said, what will you do if you're not going to get it done? Do we just not, we work for a year and we don't deliver anything? Do you get how what they said was true? Then if we didn't have it, we'd have to not release or skip the deadline. And I knew they didn't want to miss the deadline. This was a company that every November they delivered their thing, and there were reasons again for that. So they said they'd have to descope. Now they're taking stuff out. So I recognize that there's a difference between what you'd like to have and what you must have. And I talked to them. So I pointed to the wall and I said, look, I know you need all those features to make your bosses happy. I mean, this is literally what I told them. But which of these features do you need just to have a release? In other words, if you work on everything to make your bosses happy, you might have worked on stuff that wasn't needed for a release instead of those things that you did need for a release. Okay, which ones could you descope? See, I'm actually just guiding them to think about these differences. So they said about 2/3 of them were needed for a release. So I literally went to the wall and I just drew a line. It was a whiteboard, so I wasn't drawing on the wall. I took a marker and drew a line about 2/3 on the wall. And I said, okay, I want you to put all the things that you need or you don't have a release on the left and all the things that you'd like to have so you don't get in trouble with your bosses on the right. And they were, I can't remember if it was 15 or 30 minutes, but let me tell you, that was impressive. They just went up to the wall, about 5, 6 people rotating around, moving things left and right. And they did this. And they were about right. It was about 2/3 on the left or 70%, whatever. And I said, okay, this is good. And then what we decided to do, see, now this is the problem. This is Parkinson's law comes in. If you said, well, we're going to build this, I guarantee you this will take 10 months or 11 months. Do you get that? If we say, oh, we're going to just build this, then 10, 11 months would go by, Parkinson's law, we'd build all this. So I said, no, this isn't our goal. We now have 2 projects. One project is, I asked them, how long would it take this, if your estimate's right? They said about 7 months. So now we had a 7-month project and a 3-month project. So I call this Parkinson's versus, or Pareto versus Parkinson's, because this is, well, it's not 80-20, but you get it. This is what I need, and it's a subset. And I'm putting the line on the board saying we're going to do this in 7 months because otherwise Parkinson's will kill us. So we have a new project called 7 months, all the stuff that we need. Now here's what's interesting, and that's actually what they did. And I did check with them later. After we got them kicked off, they didn't really need us anymore. But when it was done, I went in there and say, yeah, go. And this cutting it down to 70% and 30% had a dramatic impact. And I had postulated this. I had expected this. And the reason is, if we have to build stuff, see, this does not just go up as a straight line. This actually probably is exponential. In other words, we might be able to build something in 5 months, but as you keep adding to it, it starts, as it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, it takes more time to build. It's just a way of life. Now, you can improve this with good architecture and good design patterns. I mean, if you're really good, maybe you can keep this linear. Most people aren't that good. Automated testing, stuff like that. So the nature of our work typically goes up faster as the time goes. So that's been my experience. If it's not your experience, then you wouldn't have gotten this value. But what I pointed to was what we now had was a 7-month project and a 3-month project. And in fact, what we kind of got was this, the 7-month and the 3-month. It's less than a 10-month project. And they said this is what happened because they knew they were going to be adding to it. So they had a decent architecture to extend. They didn't figure out all the details, but they put in the abstract layers when they needed to. So a 7-month project and a 3-month project put together in the right way is less than a 10-month project. This is called making things smaller, which we've been talking about benefits. And this was the MBI. The MBI was what they absolutely needed. They weren't going to release it because of transaction costs. They were going to wait until they had the last 3 months of new functionality. Okay, so there's almost always an MBI in an initiative. I mean, it's rare. Trick is how to find it, then build that. Breaking it up shortens the time to build it. Ask what is needed to have a release at all. What is needed to keep my bosses happy? Those are 2 different questions. People tend to not notice it. It's like maybe the difference between happy boss, boss not happy, boss going to fire me. They weren't going to get fired, but you get the idea of it. And that's an important piece.